So my name is John Winslow. I'm a librarian from Cal State East Bay. So thanks for coming up here today. I used to work at San Francisco maybe, how long was it? Like 17 or 18 years ago. So I'm glad to be back. And, thanks for those of you who kind of came up today. This was the easiest commute I had ever to come to San Francisco. So maybe if it was that easy all the time, maybe I'd still be working here, right? So I'm glad you're here. I think a lot of people are taking off for Halloween or something like that. The roads are really light today. So what I'm going to talk about today is like a little personal experiment I did comparing Primo Research Assistant to some other academic AI search tools, right? So it's kind of a personal experiment I did because I've been interested in. We don't use at East Bay, unlike San Jose, we don't use Primo Research Assistant, but I have access to it on the kind of development side. I've been playing around with it, and I could have compared it to a few other tools that have come out that do academic AI kind of research and searching. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to go. I can see my screen here. So I'm going to go talk a little bit about why I did it, kind of the background, the context, my motivation for doing it. And then I'll give you a little bit, tell you about what my methodology, what the results were, and then I would like a couple of ideas for discussion. So it's going to start out just by talking about, I've been looking at AI a lot, especially the last 6 months or so. I've kind of been assigned to be our AI librarian at Cal State East Bay, so I've kind of done some research, and what I've noticed, and I think what a lot of people have noticed, there are several challenges for using AI for research, especially for academic research. So I'm going to go through some of the challenges that we've had. So the first one I think is most people have heard about is that those when we're talking about generative AI, large language models, they sometimes get things wrong, and they're very confident often about what they get wrong, right? So it's not necessarily always reliable. And one of the biggest things that they've had trouble with that are very important for us, in academic research is citations. They're really bad. They get really bad at citations. I don't know how many of you work on the reference desk, but 2 years ago I started getting students asking me to find these papers that didn't actually exist, right? Because the AI had kind of made it up. So hallucinations, one challenge, and the other one that I've been learning more a little bit about lately is what the AI people call grounding, right? Is it's not necessarily getting things wrong, but not being able to track. Even when the AI gets things right, you're not really able to figure out where it got the information from, right? There's a I can't remember his name right now. There's a very famous AI researcher who talks about large language models as having kind of a fuzzy memory of everything on the internet. So they kind of, they've got all this information that's kind of been kind of drilled down into these kind of parameters and models and stuff that it's got a lot of information in there, but doesn't really always know where it got the information from, right? So in academic research, that's important to us, right? We don't want to just know what you think is true. We want to know where you got it, what was the citation, so it's really a challenge of kind of getting this kind of information that's kind of coming in the air and you don't really know where it came from, right? So that's the second challenge. Third one is maybe not the fault of AI itself, but as part of our academic environment, is a lot of academic information is behind paywalls, right? So the way these AI tools are trained is they just kind of vacuum up everything on the web that's free, kind of sticking them into these training models, and they kind of teach them how to kind of respond to questions based on whatever they can get on the internet or free books. But a lot of academic material that our researchers are interested in is behind paywalls. It's not accessible to the AI models, and so this is a bad spell. And all these images I kind of got from asking ChatGPT or other AIs to kind of draw pictures. I asked it to draw a picture of the robot reading the National Enquirer. It didn't get the spelling right, but I like the picture, so I went with it. So and then the fourth challenge is that people have talked a lot about is kind of bias kind of built into these machines. And so this picture is kind of a demonstration of something that's was at least a couple of years ago was pretty common in AI models, is that that you couldn't get them to understand that doctors, sometimes doctors were women. It would always answer questions assuming that whenever a doctor was mentioned, it was a man. And this comes from just it's hoovers up all the free information on the internet, and it kind of goes with statistical averages of what's most likely to be true. So it can have kind of built-in biases based on what's out there on the internet. And I think a big challenge with the bias is connected also to the grounding issue, right? Because almost anything you read is going to be biased. We all have our perspectives, our opinions, our points of view. But when all these opinions that we put up on the internet kind of get ground down into this one tool, you don't really know where it's coming from, right? You don't know where it's where its bias is coming from, or what is or what its context is. So it's going to be kind of a challenge to kind of navigate where it's getting its ideas from. So those are the four challenges that I've noticed, and I think a lot of people have noticed about using AI for research. So they're like, what I've noticed in the last few months, there are like three different ways that different types of AI builders or AI tools are trying to address and trying to make these tools better for doing academic research. So there's the kind of the frontier models, or these are the big names you've heard in generative AI, like ChatGPT, Claude, Grok. All these are doing things to kind of address this problem. Then we've got some specialized AI tools that are built, specifically for doing academic research. And then what I talk about is like bringing AI into the library, bringing AI kind of tools into library interfaces. And I think you'll hear in the next presentation that Jan and Christine are going to talk about some of these tools. So this will give you a little bit more information on these. So this is a couple of things that in the last year or so have been added to kind of the big AI models is one is called extended thinking or reasoning or research. That's where they have the generative AI think a little bit more, go back and forth a little bit more before it answers your question. You can have, if you turn on thinking module, it'll take you a little longer to get an answer from one of these tools, but it'll go back and forth and it'll do a little bit more thinking before it gives you the answer. The other one is like web research. So they also have access to the internet now. So before it answers your question, it can kind of go out and do research on the web and kind of find internet websites or different resources to answer your question. And that kind of addresses the grounding problem, because it'll kind of go out and find things for you. It'll try to do better at finding citations. And if you're doing things like deep research, with ChatGPT, which those of us in the CSU, we all have access to that if we want to. I mean, it'll go out and do 20 web searches, spend 10 minutes, and write you a 10,000 word essay on a topic. So that's one thing that's been happening to improve or attempt to improve AI for academic research. Then we have like the specialized academic AI tools. So I think the big thing to know about, which I didn't know about until a few months ago, is this Semantic Scholar, which has been around for several years. It's an open source database of academic research. They've got over 200 million papers in right now. You see the name Semantic Scholar, they're kind of competing with Google Scholar, right? So it's kind of an open source database. They say they do semantic searching. I'm not completely sure if they do, but you can find papers. I think the big thing they do is they have a free API for anybody, any kind of web developer or programmer to use to kind of use the API to kind of search Semantic Scholar. So what several tools, you may have heard about these. I've been hearing about some of these from the faculty at East Bay. There are things called Consensus, Elicit, Scite, Undermined, which are basically they're taking the papers from Semantic Scholar and kind of turning them into kind of like a chatbot that's specified for academic research. And they kind of search this, they find papers in Semantic Scholar, and they kind of add like features that researchers and scholars care about, like citation counts. Some of them will give you the journal impact factor for papers that you find. They'll kind of tell you what the research methodology was. A lot of them do kind of put things in this kind of table format so that you can sort of see like how many citations a paper has, what were the research methodology, just comes some summary. So that's another way of kind of trying to make these tools better for academic research. And then we've got, what I call just bringing AI into the library, kind of into the traditional library tools. The ones I'm familiar with, I know there are a lot of them, probably hear more of them in the next presentation, but the ones that we have at East Bay have just kind of been added, like JSTOR has a kind of a semantic search kind of thing. I think this is EBSCO. It's got something you can kind of have an AI kind of, you can talk to one of the papers you find in EBSCO with AI. I consider most of the library tools are kind of like baby steps into AI. They're not really as comprehensive as those academic AI tools. And actually, Primo Research Assistant is actually one of the more ambitious efforts to kind of bring AI into like library tools. It actually does things very similar to Consensus or Elicit. Kind of goes out and finds you a few papers that it thinks are relevant to your search, and it kind of gives you an overview. So I'm interested in Primo Research Assistant, and what my idea for this comparison idea was just to see if Primo Research Assistant could kind of hang with Elicit and Consensus and some of the purely AI tools. So does it do as well as those tools? And then a couple of weeks ago, I signed up for this. If you're interested in libraries and AI, this guy, Aaron Terry, is somebody, he has a blog. It's probably a good guy to read. He's a librarian in Singapore. He does a lot of stuff about AI. So he wrote, like about a couple of weeks ago, a really interesting blog post saying that, relevance might matter again. And what his argument was that the last 15 years or so with library discovery systems, they've all kind of done relevance ranking in the same way. There are these standard algorithms for doing keyword searching and getting results back by keyword searching. They've kind of all done the same thing. So he thinks librarians have not really paid much attention to relevance ranking and while we're evaluating these tools because it all is the same. So we're looking at other stuff like the interface, what it covers, and other kinds of library things. We're not really paying attention to relevance. But with machine learning and AI, you can do relevance ranking in different ways. I'm not going to try. I don't think I have enough time where I understand it well enough. But vector search or semantic search, what a lot of these AI tools use, is completely different from keyword search. It's not just looking for words in a paper and matching them and see how many papers match your word searches. They kind of turn words into numbers. They put them in vector space and they sort of figure out the meanings of words. And that's another kind of can use that to trying to find papers that are relevant, even if none of the keywords match kind of what you searched. And according to Aaron, so it's kind of a wild west because there's a lot of different ways to do that. Unlike with keyword searching, where we've kind of got standard algorithms, AI semantic search is kind of, everybody's doing it their own way. It's like a new way of doing things. So there's no really standard. So what he's suggesting is, when we're evaluating research tools now, maybe we have to start paying attention to how well they do relevance ranking again, which is kind of interesting to me because like 30 years ago when I was in library school, I wrote papers about, relevance ranking, but I haven't paid too much attention to it lately. Let's see how much. Although I think I won't spend too much time on it, but I think he's like partially wrong that that it's AI-powered search is brand new. What I've noticed is I think Google Scholar is already using some of these kind of AI tools. When I do research, when I do reference at the library, my typical pattern is I'll try to do a Primo search first to kind of find something for the students. If it's a really hard question, I can't find anything in Primo, I'll go over to Google Scholar, and usually I'll get better relevance results from Google Scholar than I get from Primo. And since I read this article, I've been done a little research on it. And actually, I think Google Scholar is already using some of these ideas in their databases. So anyway, what I decided to do, and I'm going to compare a Primo Research Assistant to some of these other tools, was I would first, this is something I did in a previous test. I would go and take a look at our LibAnswers kind of LibChat reference database. I think a lot of you probably use that in your libraries. It's it's an online kind of reference chat tool, and we've got a database of ever since we started using it of 4,000 questions that students have kind of typed in and asked us over chat. And I kind of went through that and found 11 kind of referencey kind of questions that I could use for a test. And then I kind of put together some way of trying to figure out how I would do relevancy ranking, right? So anyway, these are the questions. These are the first 6. So you kind of see they're all kind of reference questions, but I just took exactly what students typed in their initial inquiry into us through LibChat. This is what the student actually typed when they first kind of wrote to us. I don't know if it's kind of hard for you guys to see, but at East Bay there's a lot of students in public health, nursing. So I kind of got nursing. I got a few sociology and kind of business questions. I tried to get a range, So number 7 was a hard one, so these are the 11 questions that I used for testing, and then I had to come up with oops, I don't know if people. Oh, this is okay. So you guys can't see this at all, right? So I don't know. Can I highlight that? Let's see. Okay, where did I go? Okay, well, let's explain it then, right? It's been a long time since I've tried to figure out how to measure relevancy for something. So I came up with 4 different categories that I would use. The first is aboutness, right? Is it topically, is the paper topically relevant, right, to the search query? Second is its quality, and just is it a good paper? And I did this all based on reading the abstracts. When I was testing 4 different tools. I had 11 questions, and I went and I looked at 5 papers each, which was basically big because that's what Primo Research Assistant gives you. It gives you 5 papers. So I had about 220 papers for the whole project to look at. So I wasn't going to read 220 papers for this. I read the abstracts. But so I kind of, based on reading the abstracts, I found out, looked for the aboutness was the topic of the paper relevant to the question asked. It's the quality. Did it look like it? Did they have, did they use good, based on the abstract, did they use good protocols? Did they have a lot of data, or was it kind of a sketchy paper? Third was the credibility, right? Was this a good, was this like an academic journal that it came from? What was the, was it a good quality journal? Did it have a lot of, citations from it, right? The kind of the credibility of the paper. And the last was the recency. I kind of weighted that less than the other ones because I didn't think it was important. So I came up with for each paper, the maximum score you could get was 23, right? So if I kind of weighted mostly on the aboutness of the paper. That was the most important thing. So, and it's kind of interesting to think about, right? Because is the topic of the paper the most important thing, or the quality of the paper the most important thing, or how do they interact? One question was very interesting. One of the students asked, did the COVID-19 pandemic cause more healthcare organizations to merge, right? So that was the question of the student. And all the tools had trouble finding relevant papers for that. I got a lot of papers back that just talked about how healthcare had changed during the pandemic, right? Well, that's not really relevant to the question, even if it's like a very credible or high impact or well done paper. It's not really relevant to the question. And then, but then I get another one that's just an interview of one CEO of a healthcare organization, right? They didn't have any data, no more than one person talked to. It's just the opinion of one guy, but it was actually about the topic. So that seems to be more relevant. And then there's like the third example where one really interesting paper about how the pandemic had increased stress for healthcare employees, right? So people working in hospitals or healthcare organizations had a lot more stress during the pandemic, which you think, well, that's not really relevant to the question of whether there were mergers. But then one sentence in the abstract says that the stress of employees was one of the justifications for that organizations use to engage in mergers, because they said if we merge, we'll have more resources to devote to employee assistance programs, and our employees need more employee assistance programs because they're undergoing more stress. So it's kind of a tangential, the aboutness is kind of tangential to the question, but if it's a high quality paper, right? So, I said it's kind of a challenge. So don't take my results too like really rigorous scientific results, because I'm just trying to figure these things out. So then I'll let you know which tools that I looked at. I started out, I wanted to compare Primo Research Assistant to like a lot of these new academic AI tools like Consensus, Elicit. Scite was another one that I was interested in. And Scite, they've been like marketing stuff to me. They're the same company that does Article Galaxy. We have Article Galaxy, and it was kind of interesting and exciting because they also, not only do they have access to the abstracts of papers like these other two tools do, but they say that they've got agreements with a lot of the publishers to kind of get the full content of papers. So I thought it would be interesting, but it really kind of really crashed, at least on my first 3 tries. It was the only one that refused to give me any papers for 2 of the first 3 questions. And then the second question, when it actually gave me papers, it gave me 5 papers that were, according to Scite itself, were not relevant, right? They have their own little relevancy ranking or relevancy testing tool, and they just kind of, why would you give me 5 papers which you don't think are relevant? So I kind of crossed out Scite, and I tried to go, because I wanted to compare maybe not just to academic tools, but also to some of these, these basic tools like Claude or ChatGPT that are trying to do better at academic research. So I kind of substituted Claude for Scite. So those are the 4 four that I compared, right? So let me see. Okay, so these are just the average results. So what I did is for each question, I got the first five papers that they gave me, and I kind of calculated according to my rubric the relevancy score for each of the five papers, and then I averaged the kind of my relevancy score for each tool across the five papers that they gave me, and kind of these are the average for each question, right? And so it's kind of all over the place. They're not too far apart. They kind of go up and down, and this is the average overall. So you can see that a little bit better in this one. So actually, it turned out, at least in this test, that Claude actually was the best. It actually came up the best, and then Primo Research Assistant that's kind of at the bottom, right? This one, but not huge difference, And then this chart is actually, I kind of dumped the results into ChatGPT, and it kind of gave me this interesting chart that I wanted to figure it out on my own. This is kind of like a distribution chart for the answers. So you can sort of see that, the Primo Research Assistant, there's a lot of variation. Sometimes it did well in questions, sometimes it did poorly. Alyssa was more in the middle. And it, to be honest, this result kind of corresponded with which is maybe not surprising because I'm doing the scoring, but kind of corresponded with my subjective kind of sense of these tools, that I just found that Claude was a lot easier to use. It was much more flexible. It actually answered the questions that the students put in. These other tools, Consensus, Listen, and Primo Research Assistant kind of have a standard way of responding. Primo Research Assistant always gives you 5 articles and then a 400-word summary. That's every time, regardless of what you ask. That's what it's going to give you, right? So for example, one of the questions, somebody said like, hey, give me 8 resources on cancel culture. Right, so Primo Research Assistant will go through and give you 5. If you ask that, it'll give you 5, and it'll kind of give you a summary. What Claude, really responded more like I would expect a librarian to respond if they've had more time. It actually answered precisely kind of answered what the question was. It didn't. In most cases, if the students, a lot of these queries, the students were just asking for help finding papers. They weren't asking for a summary or an overview, things like that. But Claude, basically, if that's what as that was asked, it didn't try to give you a summary and overview of the papers. It just gave you kind of, these are some interesting resources you could try, and maybe like a librarian. So here's a few papers, but if you want to do more research, these are some places you could try to do more research. The challenge for Consensus and Elicit was that they only have academic papers, right? So if a better research for a particular question is a book, they don't have it, right? Actually, Primo Research Assistant did better on these kind of questions. For example, one question was, I want to do research on W.E.B. Du Bois's theory of Reconstruction and why the failure of Reconstruction was like a second form of slavery, right? So obviously, if you're doing research on that question, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book about that question, right? So that's probably the first research I would recommend to somebody for that. And then both Claude and Primo Research Assistant, gave me back as the first resource is W.E.B. Du Bois's book, 1935, about Reconstruction. But Consensus and Elicit, because they don't have books in their database, you got more secondary resources, papers written more recently about Du Bois's book. One ongoing, although I've said that Claude was I feel like both based on my testing and my subjective experience that Claude was actually maybe becoming of the ones I tested the best tool for like undergraduate research and looking for papers. It does still have a DOI problem. So this is my training sheet. You don't really see the colors, but all the ones highlighted here, these are just fake DOI. In several cases, it kind of made up a DOI for the paper. So, but it didn't hallucinate in the papers. All the papers it gave me, all the research it gave me actually existed. So there were no hallucinated papers, but for some reason I had trouble with the DOIs, right? And actually, because I asked a lot of questions to Claude, I got 12 questions to Claude, and this I actually had to kind of, it stopped. It didn't want to answer after the 8th one because you have to pay. So I actually forked out $20, for 1 month to kind of get Claude to continue to answer the rest of the questions. And maybe this is just my perception, but after I gave it $20, the DOIs were good, right? So, yeah. But yeah, the hallucination problem just, other than with the DOIs, really didn't exist. So I wouldn't trust it. I asked it to give me things in APA citation. I wouldn't trust it to give me citations, but the papers actually exist. So, and then the other thing, other big thing is I think grounding, right? You remember grounding is like where these tools kind of get their information and how they come to their conclusions about things. I think grounding is still a pretty big challenge. So what I got from a lot of these tools is in addition to kind of giving me a list of papers, which was what the students were asking for, especially PRA and illicit and consistent. We also give you a summary overview of what the research concludes. But often I'd found there's I couldn't figure out where the summaries were coming from, right? If I read the abstracts for the first 5 papers, a lot of times the abstracts were not telling me the same things that the summary included was telling me. So it may not be fair because I only looked at the first 5 for some of these tools. So maybe some of the summaries were coming from things deeper in the results, but it was kind of, I had a feeling that the summary I was getting was much more confident about what the research said than I would have been by kind of actually looking at the papers. For example, there was one really, and I think I have time, there's one really interesting question that, and one thing I'll say I kind of enjoyed doing this research because maybe this is why I'm a librarian. It was 11 research questions, looking at answers was kind of fun. I learned a lot of things. But one of the really interesting things I learned is one of the questions was about whether soybean farming in Brazil increases deforestation in Brazil, right? That was a research question that a student had. And what I figured out by doing this is that's a very controversial question, right? Some researchers say that because soybean farming usually happens in lands that has already been deforested and had been pasture land for cattle ranching before. So the soybean farmers kind of go into cattle ranching areas. So they're not actually cutting down trees to plant their soybean farms. And so some researchers say, well, soybean farming is a more efficient use of the land. The people are making more money by doing soybean farming rather than ranching. So it actually decreases the economic incentive to kind of cut down more trees and increase the area of deforestation. So that's one theory. The other theory is that it just displaces. So the soybean farmers are not cutting down trees, but they just displace what other people were using that land for in the first place. So the soybean farmers come in, they don't cut down new trees, but the ranchers go somewhere else and they start cutting down more trees. So it actually is part of a whole cycle of increasing deforestation. So it's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to it because I just read the abstracts of the papers. So but I think it would actually be a very interesting undergraduate research paper. Go read a couple of articles that say A, some articles that say B, decide for yourself, what's the right answer. But the interesting thing is both illicit and consensus came down with a very clear answer to the question whether soybean farming increased deforestation, but they gave opposite answers. So illicit told me soybean farming, it's pretty clear soybean farming doesn't increase deforestation in Brazil, et cetera. And consensus came and told me, soybean farming is a significant, factor in increasing deforestation in Brazil. So I'm a little bit, I think if I were advising a student, if I were teaching a class, I would advise students maybe to kind of look use these tools to look for papers, but not to read summaries, right? Because you don't want to, because maybe if I'm an undergraduate, I try in consensus, and it tells me, okay, soybean farming doesn't contribute to deforestation. Maybe that kind of gets set in my mind, right? I'm not going to, recognize that some of the papers that I'm getting back are actually saying the opposite. So I think the grounding is still kind of a challenge. Okay, let's see. How much? 10 minutes? Okay, so I'll just go quickly. So some things I've been thinking about after doing this. One is kind of what's going to happen with academic publishers and databases. Are they going to try to compete and compete with these kind of AI native tools and try to kind of keep people in their kind of walled gardens and kind of using their tools rather than letting them go out to AI to kind of do the kind of things that they've kind of done in library tools. And I think that's a big question for them. I think there's I won't try to explain it, but there's this new protocol called Model Context Protocol, and where it makes it easy for the AI tools to kind of integrate different types of things into their results. And I think, according to a paper I read recently, Wiley, one of the academic publishers, is using that to kind of share their papers and their results with the AI tools. So it's kind of possible that a lot of the academic publishers will just decide, well, we want our stuff to be where everybody is, and if everybody's going to be using AI tools, we want to make sure it's there available in the AI tool. The other possibility is they may decide to kind of try to restrict access to their materials and their abstracts, kind of force people not to use the AI tools and come to them. So I think that's a question of how things are going to go. Use cases for different types of models. So my sense is that I think if I were teaching undergraduates, I'd kind of teach them how to not try to use these kind of fancy academic specific tools like Elicit or Consensus, because I think it's just too much for undergraduates, and actually things like Claude and ChatGPT probably are better for undergraduates, and they'll answer more like a librarian would, or like how we would answer those questions. But those tools may be useful if you're like doing if you're writing a dissertation or something like really extensive research. And they also are better for scientific questions, right? They're not very good on humanities or social science questions. Measuring relevance, yeah. So I'm just guessing. I don't know how to measure relevance well, right? So, and I'm not completely sure that Aaron is right that that's the big future thing that we're going to need to figure out how to measure relevance. That's really going to be the deciding factor on how people are doing academic research. But maybe, and I think it's an interesting question. I think you could do it a lot better than I did. Maybe if you had multiple people, looking at it, and so you can kind of, make sure people are coming to the same, using the rubric in the same way and kind of coming to similar scores. And another big thing about relevance is, well, I mean, there's something called subjective relevance. So it's really the patron that decides whether the results are relevant, right? So maybe some other ways of testing that. And then last question is would I turn on Primo Research Assistant? We don't have it turned on in our library. I saw Christine's presentation yesterday about it was a whole year before they decided, of testing and looking around before they turn. So even though it's not the best, I think, that I tested it. It kind of works, and my attitude is why not? I mean, I don't have the patience to spend a whole year trying to convince other librarians to kind of turn it on. But why not? I don't see a reason for us to be kind of the gatekeepers for people, whether they can use these tools or not. If it doesn't work, people will stop using them, right? If it works, they'll use it, right? So okay, so I think I'm right at time. Thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate your attention. So I guess we have time for questions. Anybody have any questions? I don't know. I can't see online. I don't know if any questions. Christine, where to go?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Voice is not good. Thanks for the presentation, John. My question is, when you did those comparison, first you got those fake DOI. So did you notice those other tools? Do they tag those content as AI generated or sourced from a real source? Because I know some other tools, they actually clearly state this summary is from AI generated content, or this is from this actual source. So that will give you the link. So I wonder if you noticed some of the tools you listed actually tag those.
So I think if you use the microphone, I don't have to repeat the question. So yeah. So for those of us who are familiar with like Primo Research Assistant, you know how that works, where they kind of give you a 400-word summary, and then they kind of have a sentence, then a little number. If people know what I'm talking about, like sentence, which kind of refers back to the paper which that sentence is supposed to be from. So that's pretty typical in these tools. So elicit and consensus will also do something similar. So they'll give you a summary of the results. They'll write, they may be longer, depending on like how much you're paying or like what kind of research you want. They may give a longer one, but they'll also include citations, right? So they'll give you a sentence and then like 1, 5, 10. These are the papers that I'm pulling that sentence from. Okay, so that's how they try to ground it. And since you are going to this tool that says, we're an AI search tool. So I don't think they have to tell you, because you're using it. You're using an AI search tool, and it's giving you results. So I think you kind of know. But it doesn't specifically say at the end somehow these are like AI. May I not understand your question? Is that answering your question, Ken? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah.
What I was going to just comment on is just a couple of things. It's a great presentation. Thank you. Just in case you aren't aware, Jill reminded me of this, is that Claude just last month settled a $1.5 billion lawsuit because it was scanning authors' books without so it's a copyright infringement.
It was because they used books scanned by a company that pirated them. So they got the other thing they've been doing is buying a bunch of books and destructively scanning them. They did not get sued for that. That was deemed okay.
Okay.
Well, actually, yeah, the lawsuit said that if they had just purchased the books like a library had done, they could do it. It was just that they didn't actually buy the books.
Right. Thank you. The other thing I was going to say was that San Jose State has a trial subscription to Scite, and I set it up, but I haven't actually used it. Other than I understand it, it's geared towards scientific literature, so I'm not sure if that was part of the issue you experienced when you said you tested it, but who knows?
I think it might, because I just dumped in the questions the way that the students had typed in. I might have not been able to handle the unstructured form of the questions very well, but all the other ones did. So, but it was, I won't go too much by this. I just tried 3 things. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, John.
Okay, thanks, guys.